So, we're going to start our morning. We're just so delighted to have with us an international expert in Parkinson's, Dr. Ray Dorsey. Dr. Dorsey comes to us from the University of Rochester, and he's going to present a very interesting talk to everyone in this room, which is his belief that Parkinson's is a preventable disease and that exposures in our environment could be part of why so many people are getting Parkinson's. And he's going to share with us his thoughts about that. Welcome, Dr. Dorsey.
Good morning. Outstanding. I love it. It's Florida. I'm delighted to be here. Thanks to Irene for the very kind introduction. It's not my belief that Parkinson's is preventable. I think it's the fact. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about why Parkinson's disease is preventable, how you can prevent it for your children, how you can slow the progression, and maybe how we can get better treatments. But I thought I'd first start by saying why we're all here. So Dr. Michael Oken's been introducing me as his little brother. So my big brother is quite amazing. Not only is he an outstanding Parkinson's specialist, not only does he do a lot of research, not only is he one of the world's leaders in the surgical treatment of Parkinson's disease and other movement disorders, but he's a prolific writer. We've gotten to know Michael a lot for over the last 7 years as we've written a couple books together. But Michael on Amazon has like a whole library of books, and it's quite amazing what he's done. Many of you read several of these books. I've even read several of these books, everything about new treatments for Parkinson's disease and those aimed at educating people like you. And then he educates people like me about the surgical treatments of the disease. And over the last 5 years or so, we've written 2 books, one called Ending Parkinson's Disease, and a second one coming out in August called The Parkinson's Plan. You have a chance to pre-order the Parkinson's Plan, and we will give you, if you pre-order the Parkinson's Plan today, we'll give you a free signed copy of Ending Parkinson's Disease later today. So how many of you know why you have Parkinson's disease? Why only a couple of you? So why is it important to know why you have a disease? You might have a clue how to treat it and help others avoid it. Exactly. So I think all of you would prefer that your children and grandchildren don't have Parkinson's disease. So if we figure out why you have Parkinson's disease, you can prevent your children and grandchildren, your brothers and sisters, your spouse from getting the same disease. And some of you know, to the extent that genetics plays a role in the disease, your children are 2 to 4 times increased risk. So if we find out what the cause is, we can make sure our children don't. That seems like a pretty fundamental obligation. Second is you can maybe slow the progression of the disease. I'll give you an example. If someone's a smoker and they go to the doctor and get diagnosed with lung cancer, what's the first thing the doctor's going to tell them to do? Stop smoking. But if you're a farmer using pesticides and you're diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, do we tell you to stop using pesticides? So maybe the reason some individuals with Parkinson's disease have a more favorable or slower rate of progression of disease is they stop getting exposed to the chemical that's causing their disease. And maybe some people who are having a more rapid rate, maybe it's because they're continuing to be exposed. And then third, how many want a cure for Parkinson's disease? Beautiful. So what's the prerequisite to curing a disease? What's causing it, right? It's really, really, really hard to cure a disease if you don't know what's causing it. And so some of you remember hepatitis C, right? And so hepatitis C a little before I went to medical school was called non-hep A, non-hep B, because they weren't really sure what was going on. They thought it might be a virus. And then hepatitis C was a huge cause of liver cancer, huge reason why people had liver transplants. Maybe some of you have friends or family members with it. And then to our great astonishment, we can now cure hepatitis C with a pill. I'll give you another example. Some of you remember peptic ulcer disease, bleeding ulcers. What did they think bleeding ulcers was used to be due to? Stress. So they would tell you to quit your job, rest. And what did that do? More stress. So it didn't work. They would do surgeries. They would cut a nerve called the vagus nerve and do all these things to do it. What causes ulcers? Bacteria. What's the treatment? Antibiotic. Does anyone die from bleeding ulcers anymore? Right? All of you knew people who had bleeding ulcers, but now almost no one is dying of bleeding ulcers. So if we figure out what causes the disease, we can prevent it for our children, our grandchildren, our spouses, our brothers, our sisters, our friends, and our neighbors. We can slow the rate of progression of the disease, and we can ultimately get to a cure. So I'm going to tell you that Parkinson's disease is largely a man-made disease. It's due to chemicals in our food, water, and air, and it's eminently preventable. So in 1962, Rachel Carson, a biologist, wrote an outstanding book called Silent Spring. And in it, she didn't argue against the use of pesticides because she knew that pesticides can have enormous health benefits. And for example, DDT in World War II prevented thousands, if not millions, of people from getting malaria. But she was worried about the indiscriminate use of pesticides. So shortly after World War II, everyone started using DDT on everything. It was even sprayed on kids on beaches, and probably sprayed on kids on beaches here in Florida. And in her book in 1962, she said the farmers spoke of much illness among their families. In the town, the doctor had become more and more puzzled by new kinds of sickness appearing among their patients. And I think she's laying the seeds, obviously she didn't know, for Parkinson's disease. That Parkinson's disease, for example, is more common among farmers, and people who have indiscriminate use to pesticides are at increased risk for developing Parkinson's disease. So how many of you had carry a genetic risk factor for Parkinson's disease? So I see one hand, two hands. So Parkinson's disease has very, very little to do with genetics, right? So two people in this room of, 100, 200 people have identifiable genetic risk factor for disease. In fact, there's a scale that measures the heritability of diseases. It goes from 0, not heritable, to 1, perfectly heritable. And some diseases run in families. Type 1 diabetes, schizophrenia, and many mental illnesses run in families. But at the bottom of the list are diseases like Parkinson's disease and breast cancer. So Parkinson's disease is among the least heritable diseases. It has almost nothing to do with genetics. Almost nothing to do with genetics. And this is not my opinion, this is fact. So how many of you participate in the PD generation study or know about the PD generation study? So lots of people participate in the PD generation study. It's a study being done by the Parkinson's Foundation, a great study being also done here at the University of Florida. And it's asking people who have Parkinson's disease to participate in a study to assess if individuals with Parkinson's disease have a genetic cause or genetic risk factor for the disease. So you can imagine that this study might preferentially enroll people who have a family history of the disease, for example. And so they've done genetic testing on over 10,000 individuals with Parkinson's disease in North America. Over 10,000 people with Parkinson's disease in North America, including about 5 people in this room. Of that 10,000, 12.5% carry a genetic cause or genetic risk factor for the disease. Said another way, 87% of people with Parkinson's disease in North America have no known genetic mutation or genetic risk factor for the disease. Nothing. And this is exactly consistent with what Sir William Gowers, a British neurologist, said in late 1800s. He said only 15% of my patients have a family history of the disease. And even if you carry a genetic cause or risk factor for the disease, the majority of people with these genetic causes or risk factors do not actually develop the disease. So the most common genetic cause of Parkinson's disease is, is a mutation in a gene called LRRK2. Some of you have heard about this, but only about 30 or 40% of people with a LRRK2 mutation will go on to develop the disease. Said another way, there must be other factors to explain why some people who carry the most common genetic cause of the disease go on to develop the disease and why others do not. And so this is done in North America, and then our colleagues in Europe are doing a very similar study. They're doing genetic testing on people in the Americas, North and South America, and Europe and the Middle East. And they've identified that only 14% of people with Parkinson's disease carry a genetic risk factor or genetic cause for the disease. Some of you have been told that if you have a family history, you might be more likely to have Parkinson's disease. And indeed, if you have a family history of the disease, 20% of people have a genetic cause or risk factor. But 80% of people who have a family history of the disease have no known genetic cause or risk factor disease. And it's because families not just share genetics, but they share environment too. Some of you have been told that if you have young onset Parkinson's, how many people have young onset before age 50? A couple, not many. That is due to genetics. But in fact, only 20% of people with young onset Parkinson's disease carry a genetic cause or risk factor for the disease. So Parkinson's disease is fundamentally not a disease of genetics. Parkinson's disease is a fundamental disease of the environment. So what are the environmental factors that's causing Parkinson's disease? I think there are three big ones, at least in the United States, and there are likely others in addition, but I'm going to focus on three. One are certain pesticides, not all pesticides, but certain pesticides. The poster child for this is a pesticide called Paraquat. Anyone work with Paraquat? So Paraquat. So Paraquat is a weed killer developed in the 1950s, first used commercially in the 1960s. It kills the weeds that Roundup doesn't. It's so toxic that it's been used to commit homicide and suicide. It's associated with a 150% increased risk of Parkinson's disease. Over 50 countries, including China, have banned the chemical, yet Paraquat is still used in the United States, still sprayed on farms here in Florida, widely used on fields of corn, cotton, soybeans, and vineyards. Second chemical is a chemical called trichloroethylene. This is one I'm obsessed with. It's so obsessed, I carry it with me everywhere I go. Many of you remember from chemistry that water is made up of three atoms, H2O, 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. Trichloroethylene is made up of a whopping 6 atoms, 2 carbons in black, 1 hydrogen in white, and 3 chlorines in blue, hence its name, trichloroethylene. It has a cousin, it's called perchloroethylene, which has 1 additional chlorine atom here. That chemical is widely used in dry cleaning. After this talk, you will not be using dry cleaners that use perchloroethylene. And these 2 chemicals, widely used in degreasing, decaffeinating coffee, and dry cleaning, are associated with up to a 500% increased risk of Parkinson's. When you feed it to laboratory animals, they develop the symptoms of Parkinson's. They have trouble moving, and they lose their nerve cells that produce dopamine. And the third one, maybe less important for this audience, is air pollution. When Dr. Parkinson described the condition, he described it in 1800 London, and air pollution was a huge issue. And we increasingly know that air pollution plays a role in many neurological diseases, especially Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. If you want to live a short, unhealthy life, you'll breathe polluted air. If you don't, you'll breathe nice, clean air and blue skies. And it turns out that air pollution is filled with something called particulate matter. So when you see smog on a hazy day, you're seeing little pieces of dirt and soot suspended in the air. And most of those pieces of dirt and soot we cough out or sneeze out. But some are so small that they can penetrate the nerve responsible for smell and make their way back to the smell center of the brain. And hitchhiking on those particles are toxic metals like lead from gasoline, iron from brakes, platinum from catalytic converters. And if you look at the brains of people with Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease, you see high concentrations of metal in the brain. And we don't have a good explanation for why that is. In addition, the pathology of Parkinson's and Alzheimer's for most individuals begins in the smell center. And many of you know one of the earliest features of both diseases is loss of smell. So in many cases, I think these toxins we're breathing in are contributing to the rise of Parkinson's disease and to some of its early symptoms. So this is a Paraquat. This is a map of where it's sprayed according to the U.S. Geological Survey. And it's widely sprayed. It kills weeds. It's highly effective for killing weeds. But both laboratory studies and epidemiological studies in humans have demonstrated a strong association, and in laboratory studies, causation of Paraquat and Parkinson's disease. But it turns out what academic scientists and academics like Michael and I know pales in comparison to what the company knew about its product. There have been lawsuits against the manufacturer of Paraquat because farmers in different parts of the country, especially in the Central Valley of California, have been developing Parkinson's disease after exposure to Paraquat, after working for it, years later developing Parkinson's disease, and have been suing the company. Reporters from The Guardian, including Ms. Carrie Gillum, have been reviewing the legal documents that the company's having to file in their defense. And it turns out that the company knew quite a bit about their product for many years, according to The Guardian. In 1962, it was introduced as a weed killer in the United Kingdom first, and then the United States. The United Kingdom has since banned the chemical, but still exports it to the United States. In 1964, the company found that skin exposure to Paraquat in rabbits caused weakness and incoordination. In 1966, they found that large doses of Paraquat in some rats and mice result in a stiff gait or tremors. So the manufacturer of Paraquat, which is still sprayed on farms today, including in Florida, knew 60 years ago that exposure of their weed killer in 3 different mammalian species produced the features of Parkinson's disease. They knew this a generation before academic researchers reached the same conclusion. 50 years ago, regulators were concerned that workers might inadvertently lick small quantities of Paraquat residue off their lips or inhaled Paraquat mist. Rumors circulate that some in the EPA favor banning Paraquat. Despite lawsuits supported by the Michael J. Fox Foundation, the EPA has yet to ban Paraquat. Paraquat is manufactured by a company, I think, owned by a firm in China. China refuses to spray Paraquat on its farms, but the United States imports Paraquat and sprays it on ours. In 1976, a brain autopsy showed degenerative changes in the cells of the substantia nigra. For those of you not familiar, that's exactly what you see in Parkinson's disease, is loss of nerve cells in a part of the brain called the substantia nigra. And in 1985, a Canadian neurologist named Dr. Andre Barbeau was concerned about pesticides being sprayed in rural parts of Canada. So he looked at the amount of pesticides sprayed in rural parts of Canada and the rates of Parkinson's disease, and he found a near perfect correlation between pesticide use and Parkinson's disease. The company became aware of the study and warned in an internal memo that Paraquat, like asbestos, could become a huge legal liability as Parkinson's can go on for decades. So I didn't know any of this at all. And I shared this with one of my colleagues, a friend who's an English professor at the University of Rochester. And he said to me, "Ray, this is agnotology." And if you're like me, I was like, "What in the world is agnotology?" And he goes, "Ray, science is the production of knowledge, ideally for the public's benefit. Agnotology is the deliberate production of ignorance, often for corporate gain." And it's the same thing that the tobacco companies have done in the past. You know, they used to have doctors like me be advertising the health benefits of cigarettes. We've seen that with the opioid pandemic. When Michael and I were in medical school, we were taught erroneously that individuals in acute pain could almost never become addicted to opioids that were prescribed. We've seen this with social media, where the companies, according to the Wall Street Journal, who produce social media, knew about its adverse effects on the mental health of teenagers, especially girls, yet have continued to promote its use. And if this is being done to Paraquat and Parkinson's disease, it begs the question, what other chemicals are we ignorant of that are contributing to Parkinson's disease? And then what other chemicals are we ignorant of that are contributing to other medical conditions? So trichloroethylene is this widely used degreasing, dry cleaning, and even used in decaffeinating coffee in the 1970s. If you drank decaffeinated coffee in the United States in the 1970s, you might have been drinking trichloroethylene until the FDA banned its use in 1977. And this was a widely used degreasing agent. It's estimated in 1970 that 10 million Americans worked with the chemical. In England, 1 in 12 workers worked with trichloroethylene. And this is just a partial list of occupations that are associated with possible exposure to TCE. So aircraft or jet engine mechanics, I was speaking to a mechanic earlier this morning, automobile workers, dry cleaners, electronic manufacturers. It was widely used in Silicon Valley to remove residue off silicon wafers, used in embalming, oil processors, painters, printers, refrigerant manufacturers, shoemakers, taxidermists, varnish workers. And then it had a wide use of commercial and consumer uses. Speaking to one of my colleagues yesterday who might have been exposed to it in its use as a gun cleaner, but it's used to clean guns, carpet cleaners, decaffeinating coffee, paint and paint removers, pepper spray, refrigerants, even in typewriter correction fluid. Those of you who are young enough remember typewriter correction fluid and wood finishes. And it's had a wide use of industrial and military uses. It was even used to anesthetize patients. This is from one of my, the father-in-law of one of my friends who's an obstetrician. This is an article he shared with me from the American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology, in which Dr. Flowers wrote, trichloroethylene, or TCE as it's commonly abbreviated, is a potent analgesic drug. Its margin of safety and ease of administration will ultimately make it a standard agent on all delivery floors. Trichloroethylene's wide variety of uses will probably allow almost every obstetrician to find a place for it in his obstetrical practice. So women were encouraged to self-administer TCE to reduce pain, and then they would drop the canister. Some of you might be wondering whether pregnant women from this era are increased risk of Parkinson's. I couldn't find out, but there is actually a study suggesting that anesthesiologists from this era might have an increased risk of having Parkinson's disease. My colleagues, Drs. Caroline Tanner and Sam Goldman at the University of California, San Francisco, did a landmark study over a decade ago and looked at veteran twins from World War II. And they looked at twins who either had hobby or work exposure to TCE versus twins who didn't. Those who did had a 500% increased risk of developing Parkinson's, not a 5%, not a 15%, not 100%, a 500% increased risk of developing Parkinson's disease. Importantly, they showed you don't get exposed to TCE and develop Parkinson's disease the next day. There's a lag, just like you don't smoke a cigarette in your 20s and develop lung cancer the next day or the next month or next year. It's decades later. The same happens with Parkinson's disease. And because TCE is so widespread use, my colleagues wrote that the potential public health implications of these results are substantial. Yet even people like me were wholly unaware of this until I had the gift of a sabbatical and I started reading all of their papers. But TCE and Parkinson's disease is actually one of its lesser health concerns because TCE is known to cause cancer. It's not my opinion. This is the conclusion of the World Health Organization. This is the conclusion of the Department of Health and Human Services. And this is the conclusion of the Environmental Protection Agency, which says that TCE is carcinogenic, a fancy word for says causes cancer in humans by all routes of exposure, whether you come into contact with your skin, whether you drink it through contaminated water, or whether you inhale it. And TCE is associated with increased incidences of liver cancer, kidney cancer, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, prostate cancer, multiple myeloma. And we know, for example, that people with Parkinson's disease seem to have higher rates of prostate cancer, for example. TCE is also associated with leukemia, especially in children, brain cancer, and likely breast cancer. If you have worked with TCE or have stories, I'd love to hear. I'd love you to come up and tell me about them because this is how I learn. And it turns out that the increasing rates of cancer, that cancer rates in the United States are increasing, especially for people under 50. So in the United States, which spends more on healthcare than any other nation by far, in fact, we spend more on healthcare than the entire continent of Europe does, cancer rates under 50 are increasing. So this is unlikely to be genetics because genes don't change that much in just a few generations. It's not due to aging because this is happening in young adults. And it's unlikely to be done due to screening because generally we don't screen for cancers due to until people become 50. Yet in the United States, cancer rates are increasing for people under 50. At the same time, we're smoking fewer and fewer cigarettes than ever before, which begs the question of why. Diseases don't just happen by accident. Diseases have causes. There are reasons why people develop diseases. Which brings me to Camp Lejeune. So how many of you heard about Camp Lejeune? Perfect. So Camp Lejeune is a Marine base in Wilmington, North Carolina. It's one of the two major Marine bases where Marines like, can I say Dr. Hess? Yeah, like Dr. Hess, trained. And from 1953 to 1987, the drinking water at the Marine base was contaminated with TCE. It was contaminated from a nearby dry cleaner because the officers at the military base needed to have dry cleaned and cleaned and pressed uniforms. And there was a dry cleaner from which the chemical contaminated the drinking water. And there were other sources of contamination as well. And Doctors Tanner and Goldman, who did the study, and the twins from World War II, have studied service members who served at Camp Lejeune between 1953 and 1987. This study was done people who served in the 1970s, and found that Marines who served at Camp Lejeune had a 70% increased risk of developing Parkinson's disease compared to Marines who served at Camp Pendleton in California. A 70% increased risk of Parkinson's. Like their previous studies, they found that the average lag time between the diagnosis and development of the disease was 33 years. The Marines, almost by definition, were healthy, right? So to become a Marine, you have to be healthy. You're young. The average age was 20. And you're not at a Marine base for very long. So on average, they were only at the Marine base for 2 years. Yet 35 years later, they're developing Parkinson's at 70% increased risk. And this cohort is young. The average age of the cohort is only 60 years old. So in the future, when this cohort gets to 65 to 70 to 75, there are likely to be additional cases of Parkinson's disease. Among the tragedies of all this is that the Marines knew about the contaminated water, yet did nothing about it, and actually even refused to notify Marines of their exposure to the contaminated water after they became aware of it until Congress made them do so. And as they concluded in their study, millions worldwide have been and continue to be exposed to this ubiquitous environmental contaminant. And so you may be saying, I wasn't a Marine, I didn't serve in the military, or I didn't serve at Camp Lejeune, I didn't degrease metals, I didn't work in the automobile industry, wasn't one of those 10 million people. How could I have been, I wasn't exposed to TCE? And I might say, hold on, because TCE is one of the most common environmental contaminants. So many of you know about forever chemicals and their contamination of water. Turns out that up to 30% of groundwater in the United States is contaminated with trichloroethylene. So how does this happen? Well, sometimes it leaks from sewer lines, sometimes it leaks from underground storage tanks, sometimes companies or dry cleaners or military bases dispose of it inappropriately, and it gets it down into the soil, and then depending on where you live, 15 to 50 feet below the surface, probably less in Florida, is groundwater. And once TCE makes its way down to the groundwater, it can form concentrated pockets of it and can form plumes that will then migrate with the groundwater. And these plumes can move up to a mile or more away. And many of you know that radon can evaporate from the soil and into your basement, for example, and can cause lung cancer. Well, TCE can evaporate from groundwater or soil and enter your home, your kid's school, or your workplace and breathe it in undetected. like Southern California, and high rates of Parkinson's, and other areas of the country like the Mountain West have low levels of air pollution and low levels of Parkinson's disease. And so you can see in red are areas of the country with high levels of air pollution and high levels of Parkinson's disease, especially in the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys. And as I said, in the Mountain West, low levels of air pollution and low levels of Parkinson's disease. There have been even studies that suggest among people who already have the disease that high levels of air pollution exposure are associated with an increased risk of hospitalization. So if you have Parkinson's disease, you might be particularly sensitive to not getting exposed to air pollution. Because as many of you know, by the time you get diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, 60% of those nerve cells that produce dopamine in the brain are already lost. You want to protect those remaining 40%. You want to avoid exposure to pesticides. You want to avoid exposure to dry cleaning chemicals, and you want to avoid exposure to air pollution. And so how does this all fit together? So this is how the science might work. One of my colleagues, in 2003, a German pathologist named Dr. Heiko Brock had a provocative idea. He said that Parkinson's disease, which we think of as a brain disease, he said Parkinson's disease does not begin in the brain. So in 2003, a German pathologist said Parkinson's disease does not begin in the brain. He says, when I look at the brains of individuals with Parkinson's disease, I see the pathology either beginning in the smell center, the nose, part right behind the nose, in the brain, or I see it in this nerve that goes to the gut called the vagus nerve. And he thought that like polio, which is spread by drinking or eating contaminated water, might begin in the gut and then spread upwards like a row of dominoes, spread upwards from the gut to the parts of the brain that control sleep, that control our blood pressure, and then to the parts of the brain that control movement, and spread upwards from there. In 2019, Dr. Per Borghammer, one of our colleagues in Denmark, said that there is a body-first form of Lewy body disorders, or body-first form of Parkinson's disease, that begins in the gut and spreads upwards, and then there's a brain-first or nose-first model disease where the pathology begins in the nose and then spreads backwards to the parts of the brain that are responsible for slowness of movement. So I read all his great papers and I marked them all up in my living room, and then I emailed them and said, this seems like a great model for explaining how chemicals that we either ingest could contribute to a body-first or gut-first form of the disease, or chemicals that we inhale might contribute to a nose or brain-first model of the disease. So we wrote this paper, a hypothesis paper, in which we argued that indeed chemicals that are swallowed or ingested, like the Marines at Camp Lejeune, might have Parkinson's disease begin in the gut, and they might have early constipation, early problems with blood pressure, early problems with sleep disturbance, and tend to have a more symmetric form of Parkinson's because the gut gets innervation from both sides of the body. Or people might inhale the chemical, starts on one hemisphere, they have asymmetric Parkinson's disease affecting one side more than the other. They have early motor features of the disease and only later get problems with sleep, only later get problems with constipation, and only much, much later get significant problems with thinking. So now I'm going to tell you that Parkinson's is rising and preventable, which you guys already know. So this is my report card, I think. It turns out that Parkinson's disease is one of the world's fastest growing brain diseases. And this is happening on my watch. This is happening on Michael's watch. And so you should ask the question, well, who's responsible for making sure that Parkinson's disease doesn't spread? And I think it's me. And so this has all happened in the 1990s when I graduated high school, and so all this has been happening on my watch. And if I'm such a smart guy, shouldn't I be doing something to prevent people from getting Parkinson's disease? And my colleagues in the HIV community have woken up and addressed HIV, and lots of us don't get HIV because they have woken up and changed the course of HIV. During the COVID-19 pandemic, our colleagues in infectious disease responded and prevented lots of us from getting COVID-19. Stroke is actually decreasing because we're now preventing stroke. We're smoking less, we're taking better control of our blood pressure and our cholesterol, and we even have better treatments for stroke. But Parkinson's disease, we're not. The status quo is failing. And that's evidenced by all the people in this room, that's evidenced by all the people on Zoom, and that's evidenced by the fact that 200 Americans were diagnosed with Parkinson's disease yesterday, and 100 Americans with Parkinson's disease will die today. But there's a great story here, that if we know what the causes of Parkinson's disease, we can actually prevent it. And it turns out that while Parkinson's disease is rising globally and rising rapidly in the United States, there are some parts of the world, especially in Europe, where the incidence, the number of new cases of Parkinson's disease appears to be declining. And there's one study called the Rotterdam study. It's called the Rotterdam study because it's done in a port city of Rotterdam in the Netherlands, where the incidence of Parkinson's disease between 1990 and 2011 dropped by 60% after adjusting for age. A 60% drop in the incidence, number of new cases of Parkinson's disease in the span of just 2 decades. And the authors didn't have a good explanation for why. So I went back. This isn't the way you like to do research. You don't like to go backwards. You like to go forwards. But I went backwards and I said, let's look at the 3 things I'm most concerned about: pesticides, trichloroethylene, and air pollution. And it turned out between 1968 and 1986, levels of DDT, which are fat-loving, they dissolve in fat, dropped in the fat tissue of the Dutch population between 75 and 90% in just 2 decades. They got rid of DDT, and DDT plummets in people's fat tissue. Turns out in 1981, the Netherlands had the lowest level of TCE in their outdoor air of any country in Europe, or one of the lowest. And it turns out that in the decades preceding this decline in the incidence of Parkinson's disease, air pollution rapidly improved in Western Europe. It's rapidly improved in the United States, except for these problems with the Canadian wildfires. And that 20 years later, you see a 60% drop in the incidence of Parkinson's disease. You get rid of these chemicals, you get rid of Parkinson's disease. If you do not have chemical exposure to these chemicals, I don't think you develop Parkinson's disease for the vast majority of individuals. You're just not going to get it. So I think we can create a world without Parkinson's. So one of the books I didn't show you that Dr. Michael Oken wrote was his first. It's Lessons from the Bedside. It is little stories that Michael wrote on napkins, on gauze pads. When he was on note cards, when he was a medical student, he put them into his dirty white coat, and then later transcribed them into a book that's available on Amazon. And I read a little bit of it, and it's quite good. And it clearly taught us that we need to be empathetic. We need to feel what other people feel. And one of the first stories in the book, he writes this: can we feel other people's pain? Pain, like all other emotions, is shared. Pain never really disappears, but fades away. Remember that other people's pain is also your pain. So the reason I'm passionate about this is because Parkinson's disease sucks, right? This is what Michael J. Fox says multiple times in his books and in interviews. Parkinson's disease sucks. And although no one in my immediate family has Parkinson's disease, I didn't grow up with a grandmother with Parkinson's disease, I know how bad it is. And so when I see people walking on the Erie Canal in Rochester, when I see people in the airport with Parkinson's disease, when I see people walking the streets of Gainesville or wherever it is with Parkinson's disease, I get pissed off. And I get pissed off because I know Parkinson's disease is bad, I know that they're suffering, and I know what the future holds for them. And I know what the future holds for them and their loved ones. And if we can prevent Parkinson's disease, I can't think of a more fundamental responsibility than for us to do so. So my son is a budding philosopher, and I'll tell you 2 stories. One, when he was in high school, we're driving the car, and he goes, "Dad, do you think my classmates know the difference between epistemology and metaphysics?" "Son, I'm quite sure they don't." "And then can you tell me what the difference is myself?" He did. And then he goes, "Dad, do you know who Derek Parfit is?" And I go, "No, I don't know who Derek Parfit is." And he goes, "Dad, he's only the most influential philosopher of the second half of the 20th century." And so Derek Parfit was this philosopher at Oxford, where my son is now studying. And he said that we should care for people regardless of distance. He wrote this book called Reasons and Persons. And he says, this beautiful analogy, you should comfort your neighbor and you should comfort people around the world. In fact, if your arm were infinitely long, you would not only reach out to your neighbor, but you would reach out to people on the other side of the world who are hurting. And then Dr. Parfit then extended this analogy to time. Well, he says if we care about people regardless of distance, shouldn't we care about people regardless of time? Shouldn't we care about people who are our contemporaries? And then shouldn't we care about generations that are to come? Shouldn't we care about our future children and grandchildren? And one of his disciples is a philosopher, William McCaskill, a young man in England, and he wrote this really good book about what we owe the future. And I think we owe the future a lot because we've inherited a lot. And so many of you are young enough to remember about polio, right? And so many of you know that we live now in a world that's largely free of polio because of a march of dimes, because ordinary people like you in Gainesville, Florida, banded together, raised money for polio research, identified what its root cause was, identified that it was a virus, and then 17 years after the March of Dimes began, Jonas Salk announced the vaccine. That was later followed by a vaccine from Dr. Albert Sabin, and we live in a world that's largely free of polio. There are no polio treatment centers, there's no polio conference groups, there's no polio support groups, there's just no polio. In 1980, the daughter of Candace Leitner, a 13-year-old daughter, was struck by a drunk driver, a car driven by a drunk driver, and was literally knocked out of her shoes and died. 4 days after Ms. Leitner lost her daughter, she begins lobbying the state legislature in California to take actions to reduce drunk driving. In 1980, when her daughter died, drinking and driving was actually legal in some states in the United States. Every day for a year, she went to the governor of California's office, then Jerry Brown, and petitioned to change the laws. 8 years later, drinking and driving is illegal in all 50 states. The drinking age is raised from 18 to 21. Blood alcohol levels dropped to 0.08. Today, 10,000 fewer people die from drinking and driving accidents than they did in 1980. In fact, that's happened every year since 1988. That's 10,000 children not killed, 10,000 families not torn apart, 10,000 communities that don't grieve, and many of us are alive today because of the works of Candace Leitner. In 1987, HIV is rapidly killing people in New York City and in San Francisco, and a man by Larry Kramer, who was a playwright, formed an organization called ACT UP. And the motto of ACT UP was silence equals death, because for HIV in the 1980s, if they didn't make their voices heard, they died. And for people with Parkinson's disease, if we don't make our voices heard, we don't die, but we just suffer, right? And we suffer a lot. And because of the actions of Larry Kramer and his colleagues, 8 years after they found their voices, they developed protease inhibitors, which have led to a near normal life expectancy. More people with HIV, a great portion of people with HIV are appropriately treated for their condition than Parkinson's disease. HIV is preventable with a condom. The incidence of HIV in the world is at its lowest level since 1990, and it's likely that HIV will disappear as a major clinical entity in our lifetime if we continue to do the good work that they have started. So we've inherited a world where polio is largely non-existent. We've inherited a world where drinking and driving is socially unacceptable, and we've inherited a world where HIV is both preventable and treatable. These are gifts that we've received from previous generations. You have an obligation to receive a gift, and you have an obligation to reciprocate. But we're going to need to act to change the course of Parkinson's disease. And that was the central message of our first book, Ending Parkinson's Disease, that if we found our collective voices, if we made enough noise, that if we came together like we're doing today in a church, we could change the course of Parkinson's disease, not just for our generation, but for all generations to come. And if we do so, if we identify what the root causes of the disease, we can prevent it, we can slow its progression, and we can eventually develop a cure for it. So in our book, our next book, we come up with the Parkinson's 25 things that you can do to slow the rate of progression of Parkinson's disease, and 25 things your children, your spouse, your brother, your sister, your neighbor, your friend can do, your enemy can do to not develop Parkinson's disease. And so it starts off with some simple ones like washing your produce, even your organic ones, because we know that food has residues of pesticides on it. It talks about changing your diet, just like you heard earlier today, that the Mediterranean diet, high in fruits and vegetables, low in animal products, might be helpful. I don't think it's helpful because of the nutrients of the fruits and vegetables, but I think it might be helpful because as food makes its way up the food chain, that animals might have higher levels of these fat-loving chemicals in their tissues, and then that we eat those tissues, and then they get concentrated in our body further. We talk about making sure that your grocery store is not located near dry cleaners, because dry cleaners, that chemical is also fat-loving, and that in German grocery stores located next to dry cleaners, when you eat the butter and the cheese from those German supermarkets, you are eating TCE and PCE. And then we talk about enjoying your wine without pesticides, because a study done in France showed that almost every bottle of wine that they tested in France had residues of pesticides in them. And we need a plan. We need a plan to prevent Parkinson's disease for future generations. We need a plan to prevent Parkinson's disease for this generation, and we need a plan to treat this disease. And so one of the great accomplishments of last year was the passage of the National Plan to End Parkinson's Disease. This was supported. Two of its chief sponsors were Congressman Gus Bilirakis from here in Florida and Congresswoman Jennifer Wexton from Virginia. Congressman Bilirakis' family has Parkinson's disease, and Congresswoman Jennifer Wexton has a rare Parkinsonian disorder called PSP, or progressive supranuclear palsy. This bill, which passed the House 407-9, chief sponsor was a man and a woman, a Republican and a Democrat, someone who's had family members affected by the disease, and someone who's been directly affected by the disease. This bill unanimously passed the Senate and was signed into law by President Biden. If we can come together, we can develop a plan, for the first time, a federal plan to prevent, treat, and cure Parkinson's disease, but we need to act. I like to read, as you probably gathered, and I was introduced to Susan Sontag. Anyone know Susan Sontag? So the late writer from New York City, she wrote this great book on photography, and she's got this great line, and it's, be serious, be passionate, and wake up. And I don't think we've been serious enough. I certainly don't think we've been passionate enough about Parkinson's disease. I mean, think about what people with HIV did. They developed a quilt to cover the National Mall. I mean, they barricaded themselves in the streets of New York. They overtook the New York Stock Exchange. They overtook the FDA. We have not found that voice for Parkinson's disease, and because we have not found that voice, more and more people are suffering. And we need to wake up. Parkinson's disease is not fundamentally a disease of aging. You don't put a mice in the laboratory and sit it there for 20 years and it spontaneously develops Parkinson's disease. The only way that mouse is ever going to develop Parkinson's disease is if we manipulate its genes or expose it to toxic chemicals. And Parkinson's disease has very little to do with genetics, as I've discussed here. Parkinson's disease is fundamentally a disease of our environment. It's due to chemicals in our food, water, and air. So what should we do? I think we should resolve here on the 23rd annual gathering of this organization that 10 years from now, in 2035, that the incidence of Parkinson's disease is no longer rising but falling. That the incidence of Parkinson's disease in Florida, in the United States, and around the world begins to fall in 10 years. We saw what we can do in the Netherlands with a 60% decline over 20 years. What can we do in Florida in 10 years? And then on the 46th anniversary of this organization, we should be planning for its demise. The March of Dimes no longer invests in polio because polio has been taken care of. We should take care of Parkinson's disease. Thank you very much.